Hi, my name is Alister Chapman, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use the Cine EI mode in the Sony FX series cameras. Now, why do we want to use the Cine EI mode? The Cine EI mode works in a very similar way to most high-end cinema cameras, such as Sony's Venice 2 camera. And it allows you to capture the maximum dynamic range in order to get the best possible image to take into post-production for your post-production color grading. Two terms that do get confused is exposure index and ISO. They are two different things. The ISO of a camera is the recording sensitivity. So when the camera is set to 800 ISO, the sensitivity of the camera is rated at 800 ISO. Exposure index is different. It is not the same as ISO. It uses similar numbers, but it does a different thing. The exposure index is how bright your lookup table is, not the recordings. So a high exposure index makes the lookup table brighter. A low exposure index makes the lookup table darker. But that doesn't actually change the sensitivity of the camera, only how bright or how dark the lookup table is. And we use the difference between the lookup table and the base ISO to offset our exposure either brighter or darker, depending on what we're shooting and the range of highlights or the range of shadows that we need. So one of the limitations with the Cine EI mode is that you must shoot at the camera's base ISO, because it's only at the base ISO that you're going to get that maximum dynamic range. If we raise the ISO by adding gain in the camera, perhaps by using the flexible ISO mode, then we reduce the amount of dynamic range that can be recorded, and we add extra noise, so we limit our image quality to some degree. Now, there will be some situations, perhaps when shooting in very low light, where you do need to use the flexible ISO mode because it's simply too dark to shoot in the Cine EI mode. But be aware that if you do choose to do that, you will have more noise in your pictures and you will be limiting your dynamic range. The Cine EI mode is really designed for getting the very best out of the camera. So how does Cine EI work? Well, it works by first of all locking the camera to the base ISO, and then we apply a lookup table to our output and we monitor via the lookup table. If you don't use a lookup table, the Cine EI mode won't work. And then we change the brightness of the lookup table according to the exposure index to make the lookup table brighter or darker. So for example, if I'm shooting at 800 ISO base and I have my exposure index set to 800, then the brightness of the LUT will match the recording ISO, so there is no offset applied to my recording, and I simply expose at 800 EI and everything looks normal as it should. But if I change the exposure index to 200 EI, which is 2 stops less than 800, the LUT becomes 2 stops darker, and as a result, the viewfinder image becomes 2 stops darker. To compensate for that dark-looking image, you'll then open the aperture, remove some ND, or increase the lighting so that the amount of light that falls on the sensor increases by 2 stops. Those 2 stops of extra light falling on the sensor mean that your recording will become 2 stops brighter, so compared to the original image, you'll have less noise, you'll have a greater shadow range with 2 stops more shadow information, but because you're putting more light onto the sensor, your highlight range will be reduced by 2 stops. So we use the exposure index function to shift the midpoint of our exposure range. When we use a low exposure index, we will have a brighter recording, and that means we'll have less noise, a greater shadow range, but reduced highlight range. But if we go the other way and use a high exposure index value, then the image in the viewfinder, the image on your monitor becomes brighter, so you'll close the aperture down a bit to compensate, and that means that the amount of light falling on the sensor is reduced, So the recorded image will be a bit darker, and therefore it will have less shadow range, but because it's that bit darker, you will increase the highlight range. So we're able to move the midpoint of our whole exposure range up and down. So generally for most things, you simply match the exposure index to the base ISO. Then you can look at your viewfinder or monitor. If the image looks correct, if it looks nicely exposed on the viewfinder or monitor, press record and off you go. It's as simple as that. With the newer cameras from Sony, there is no reason to overexpose or shoot extra bright with everything. But if you are shooting a scene that has a lot of shadow areas, a lot of darkness in it, perhaps a romantic scene or something like that, then it may be preferable to use a low exposure index. The low exposure index value makes the image on your monitor appear darker, and as a result of seeing that darker image on your monitor, you'll open the exposure up, increase your light, reduce the ND, so that more light falls on the sensor, giving you that greater shadow range, which could be important for a dark scene, and also a bit less noise, so that when you take that footage into post-production, you have a bit more grading flexibility due to the reduced noise. And it may be that if you're shooting outside on a very bright day where there are lots of highlights, that you might go to a slightly higher exposure index, perhaps going to 1600 EI when shooting at 800 base ISO, and that will give you a slightly brighter image on your viewfinder or monitor. And then you'll be encouraged then to compensate by closing the aperture a little bit, adding a bit of ND, so the recording becomes a bit darker, increasing your highlight range, decreasing the shadow range a bit, and also that image will be a little bit more noisy, and that could reduce the amount you can grade it in post-production. The one exception to always shooting at the base EI and base ISO is when we're using the FX6 or FX3 and its high base ISO mode. At 12,800 ISO base, the FX3 and FX6 are a little bit more noisy than they are at 800 base. So in that situation, it might be preferable to use an exposure index between 3,200 and 6,400. Using an exposure index of 6,400 means that you'll put an extra stop of light onto the sensor. And that extra stop of light, that brighter recording, means that in post-production, you'll generally be bringing your levels down a little bit, and that will help reduce the noise a bit, compensating for the fact that at 12,800 base, the camera is a little bit more noisy. If you use the camera's Cine EI quick function, it will automatically move from the camera's low base ISO to its high base ISO as you increase the exposure index. The point where this happens has been carefully selected to give the best possible noise performance, and for most applications this makes it the easiest of the Cine EI modes to use. Rather than judging your exposure simply by looking at the viewfinder image, you can also use a white card and zebras to set the exposure. If you're using the default Sony S709 LUT, then a white card or white paper should be exposed at 77%. So, if you set your zebras to 77% and expose so that the zebras cover your white card, you'll know that you're correctly exposed. If you're using an FX6, when you set the zebras to 77%, a yellow line will appear across the camera's built-in waveform display, and you can also use this to ensure your exposure is correct. But do note that the waveform display measures the signal on the HDMI or SDI outputs, so you must have the LUT enabled on the SDI or HDMI outputs to ensure that the waveform is measuring the LUT. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you now find it easier to use the Cine EI mode. Myself, I use this mode most of the time. The only exception is shooting in very, very dark environments, and in that case I might use flexible ISO, but I am aware that if I use flexible ISO and I start raising the ISO of the camera, I'm adding a lot of gain in the camera. So yes, the pictures do become brighter, and that can be helpful, but they also become more noisy, and that may limit how much you can grade your footage and what you can do with it in post-production. So there is a place for flexible ISO in very low light situations, but the rest of the time I shoot using the Cine EI mode to maximize my image quality and what I can do with my footage in post-production. Thank you for watching. Enjoy shooting with your camera.